I do still think of myself as an economist. Others may think of me differently, but the way I think is as an economist. I do, as you said, do a lot of the media stuff. It's not the thing that I enjoy most or that I think I'm best at, but I think it is really important that we all tell the story about what the railway can do and is doing for the economy, for communities, for customers, and for the staff, because it is a fantastic story, but that doesn't in any way deflect from the fact that we have to keep improving, and there's a lot of challenges we have. Actually, just very recently appointed somebody to the team who will be doing much more of that. So yes, the national media, in the sometimes confrontational situations, I'll continue to do it, but really keen to have this new person come in and have the space to go out and tell proactively the stories of the many thousands of people who work in the railway, the many thousands of millions of customers, the communities that we serve, and what it does for the economy. So that's about being much, much more proactive in getting out there and explaining and extracting from people like you the power of those stories to tell to the public. So the one thing that Rail Delivery Group does that is unique, if you like, is to bring together all parts of the industry, and that's incredibly important. There are many parts, and I don't say that as a good thing or a bad thing. In an industry this size, there will always be many parts, however it's organised. And we try to bring those businesses together, the parts of businesses together. And really the key point of why we're trying to do that is to confront some of the difficult issues between the different bits of the railway, however it's organised, and also between the railway and its stakeholders, customers, the government. So to really try and confront those things and challenge the status quo, enable change. It's quite interesting, if you ask many people what in some ways we have stood for in the past, people might think that actually it's about protecting and stopping change, whereas actually what we're trying to do is enable change for the better, have a clearer long-term plan, confront difficult issues rather than duck them. And that's difficult, it's hard, but it's worthwhile, and it's what we're trying to do. The environment we're in at the moment in the railway, but also more broadly, clearly there's a huge amount of uncertainty out there around the economy, what that's doing, around the political situation, and also within the railway around the challenges to delivery and to uncertainties around funding. So that's some of the environment we're in, and confronting the difficult issues in that situation is even more important rather than ignoring them, which is what we're trying to do. And I'll say a few things about what we see as some of the priority issues that we're trying to help confront within Rail Delivery Group or between Rail Delivery Group and the stakeholders. And the first one of those, I think, is a sort of label Network Rail, and a couple of aspects I'll highlight about it, because there is a clear plan within Network Rail for its transformation, devolving accountability to its roots, so that they can really be empowered for engaging with their customers, the train operators, to focus obsessively on the end customer and value for the taxpayer. And that simple model, which has been through a number of reviews, McNulty and Shaw and lots of other luminous people, the basic model of saying you need that clear line of sight, the supply chain into the infrastructure manager, to the train operator and to the end customer, I think is really powerful. And the whole structure is described sometimes as complex, but actually that basic line of sight is what we're trying to create locally and to join it up nationally. So that strategy, if you like, is quite clear, and Mark Clarn and the team have been very clear about that. And the succession, Mark's succession, will be absolutely critical in driving forward that strategy, making it happen as far and fast as possible. So we have those truly empowered route businesses operating within a framework, engaging with their supply chain and their customers to focus, as I say, obsessively on the end customer. The other aspect of the Network Rail issue, is the funding question, and we're at this really critical time in Network Rail in the 5-year process around funding, about confirming that money, and a very positive story of commitment from governments, say governments rather than single government, but governments and regional bodies, to the funding of the infrastructure, which is so critical to the future. But that needs to be closed out over the next few months. It's not over yet. We need to continue to make the case for that funding and continue to really make sure that I say the local teams, the local routes, their suppliers and their customers, the train operators, are engaging on developing the detailed plans as to how that money is going to be used to drive the sustainability of the asset and the performance of that asset, so we can provide excellent service. So that's a critical time in terms of funding and in terms of follow through on the strategy that's been established. The second issue, and I'll highlight, it flows very much from that, is around performance, punctuality, the reliability of our railway, which in the context of Rail Delivery Group and the Rail Delivery Group Board, in a sense, shouldn't be at the focus of the discussions. But when performance is not as good as we all want it to be, it absolutely is so critical for customers and the economy that those chief executives, those rail groups are very, very engaged in understanding what it is more we can do to drive that performance for customers. So that's right at the top of the list of the priorities we're focusing on at the moment. Critically, one of my strategic boards just written, the chair of that board, to all of the train operators and to the routes, obviously highlighting what we all know, that in some parts of the railway the performance is excellent, in other parts it's not as good as we want it to be. And the way to address that clearly is a focus on the infrastructure and the trains, but critically to focus on that partnership locally between the train operators, infrastructure manager, because it's a whole system and it needs to work locally. And then critically as well, supporting that nationally with excellent timetabling processes and systems so that we can make it work glued together as a whole railway that's seamless for customers. So the local and then the national glue is key there. So that's Network Rail and performance. The third issue I talk around is reform of the contractual regulatory framework. And people think that reform sometimes is a one-off issue and we'll get it better and it'll all be all right and then we can leave it alone. Certainly when I worked at the ORR and under one of the regulators, the view, well, actually we're going to crack this and it will be perfect forever. I don't think that's the way regulation and contracting works. It has to evolve and certainly needs to evolve. But I don't think that in any way, personally, that the model is unworkable. It can be made to work. We know what needs to be done to make it work. And we're setting out those plans. There are many detailed issues there around franchise reform and regulation. One of the things I find people most easily grasp is the issue around franchising, where people bid for a franchise and they have to fix their numbers about what they're forecasting for performance or for growth in traffic and travel, and they don't actually get control of the business until perhaps 18 months later. So this period of 18 months is pure risk and uncertainty that adds absolutely no value in terms of the ability of that new operator to be able to control it. And it's entirely avoidable because we can effectively reset those numbers at the time when the franchisee starts to operate based on external data as to what has actually happened. So it doesn't cause incentive problems or anything. It's entirely avoidable. So that's an example of one of the things we can do and we're advocating doing to the franchising bodies, the governments and so on, in DFT and in Scotland and TfL, to effectively reset the numbers based on what actually happens between the finalisation of the bid numbers and when the person turns up. But there are other things as well that we know we can do to make the system work. To make sure, for example, that train operators' incentives are aligned with the infrastructure manager's incentive so we can make the partnership work locally. So we're advocating those reforms to make that work effectively. Another example around that is the need for flexibility. The world does change, and we need to be able to adapt to that. There's strong advantage in long franchises and long control periods, but that shouldn't be set in absolute stone. We have to have the ability to adapt to circumstances commercially and be able to make sensible decisions during control periods or franchises, whatever it is, rather than tying our hands behind our back commercially and not allowing ourselves to deal with those changes. So I think that flexibility is important, but it does require maturity from all parts of the industry, government, regulator, routes, train operators, supply chain, maturity to be able to work flexibly and not to see that as some sort of failure. So the next thing I highlight is around ticketing. People often bracket fares and ticketing into one, and I'll talk a bit about fares in a minute, but ticketing to start with, in terms of the technology and the way in which we buy tickets or buy the right to travel on the railway. I think that we actually now have a pretty good plan, and the plan is being delivered for transforming that. And we know or have a view about what can happen to further evolutions of that as technology comes on and so on. So actually during this year, that will be, we will be able to use smart ticketing of some form pretty much across the country. That will evolve around barcode and digital wallet in the future, but that is coming. Much of it is here, and you'll see that, people will see that very quickly. It clearly continues to evolve as technology evolves, but the underpinnings of what we're doing now will make that much more flexible to be able to evolve as technology develops, in my view. But beyond that, fares, we need also to reform the structure of fares. I'm not here talking about the thing I get criticised for several times a year when I appear on the television around the level of fares. Ultimately, that is a political question, the balance between how much taxpayers pay and how much customers pay. That is, quite rightly, in my view, a decision that governments have to make. But I'm talking about the structure of fares and people having the confidence that they're getting the right fare when they buy it through whatever means. So that has evolved over many years, and we need to find a way of simplifying that and enabling people to have confidence in what they're buying, but still enable us to be able to afford, through the revenues we get from tickets, to continue to invest and improve in the railway. So there's a balance in there around the reform of the fares structure that's really key. And then the final thing, two things I'll mention that draw some of those priorities together. One of them is the sector deal, which you'll have heard about, I'm sure, in some of the speeches earlier in the week. So the opportunity there is quite interesting because the railway industry historically has spoken a lot to the Department for Transport. And the railway industry hasn't always been totally joined up between its parts, by which I mean train operators, freight, infrastructure, and the supply chains. So one of the interesting things about the sector deal is that it is talking to a bigger government. It's talking to broader parts of government, not just the Department for Transport. And that's really important in the context of not just Britain's railway, but Britain's railway supply chain and what we can do by delivering improvements here and creating jobs and opportunities from exports and so on. So it's critical across that broader part of government. It's critical around some of the digital technology that we can introduce and get further ahead as a country in our supply chain. But the same in terms of on the other side of the equation, a deal by definition is between two parties, government and joining up different parts of government and the industry, and here in the context actually joining up particularly the supply chain with the rest of my organisation, effectively train operators, infrastructure managers. Because actually, although sometimes the conversations are separate, for a long time they have been exactly the same conversation. There is no real fundamental misalignment, in my view, between what the supply chain has been arguing for, what the rail operators have been driving for, infrastructure managers. The alignment is enormous, and we have not exploited that alignment as much as we could, in my view. So that's another reason why the sector deal is interesting, because it is bringing that all together. In many senses, they're not new issues. They're issues we've been debating for a long time, but having a stronger alignment around it and talking to a broader government, I think, is an important opportunity. And the biggest aspect of all of that is around digital railway. around the opportunity we have in this country and for our railway to accelerate the introduction of digital railway, get more capacity out of the infrastructure we have. In global terms, I think we are brilliant at getting the most out of the infrastructure we have. But that will take us to another level and enable us to get even more out of it. But we will have to be brave along the way. And I think the sector deal is an important part of making sure all parts are joined up in making that case. And the final thing I'll mention, the concept again of bringing it together in a way, is sort of building on what I said at the beginning about telling stories, communication. So last October, we published a document. I stood up at St Pancras. We had a lot of people supporting it, launching a plan. We had the long-term improvement of the railway and Partnership for Britain's Prosperity, talking about what the railway does for customers and what it does for communities in connecting them, for the economy and for the staff. One of the interesting things, I think, is that the narrative in the public, people think that it is a declining industry. Actually, we need more people working in this industry. We need them to be more focused on slightly different things, particularly around customer and around new technology. But we absolutely need more people, and there's more opportunity to train and develop apprentices and others coming into our industry, in getting greater diversity of our workforce. I think there's a massive opportunity there for us to be leading the way as an industry in this country to drive the railway, but also to drive opportunities for exports. So that's what that story was about, if you like, nationally. But the other thing we were really clear about is that that doesn't work for most people. That national story has to be made real locally. And one of the things we've been doing since then, as well as the appointment I mentioned earlier, and getting much more out in social media through that, but one of the things we're trying to do is to tell that story locally. So the first local plan for the West Country, effectively, we launched a month or so ago. And now what we're having is the local teams, the local routes and train operators saying, I want one too, please. So instead of us pushing that to them and saying, please do this, they're now saying, please can I have one? Please can you help me to develop that local plan so that we can talk locally to communities, customers and staff about what the railway does for them and for the economy locally. So I think that's incredibly important, making it local and meaningful for the customers and communities. We can't do that. I certainly can't do that at a national level, but we can help those local teams to do it, give them the tools to do it, and give the many thousands of people in the railway the confidence to go out and be advocates of what we're doing for customers and communities. The other thing we have to do, as well as making it meaningful locally, is to make it real. So just standing up and having a narrative, an important narrative about change, and that's key, but we have to actually then really follow through on it. So that launch last October included 4 key commitments about what it is we're going to do to drive those improvements. Some of the things I talked about today around performance, around transformation, around network rail, about ticketing and fares, those are all part of that. But we as an industry, I think, need to be held to account for delivering on those commitments, for making it a reality, and for explaining it to the public, and giving people like yourselves the confidence to be advocates so we can keep improving for the long term for our country. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you very much. Some stimulating ideas and I think some real leadership there as well, which the industry needs to get behind. Not that many chances potentially to ask Paul questions face to face, so this is your chance now to pitch in, please. Okay, I'm going to start people off then, Paul. So you talked, you talked about a number of really interesting things there. One was diversity. I know that you personally put your time and effort into trying to assure diversity in the industry. I'd just say it's really good to see diversity in the audience as well. You talked about the sector deal. And when I look across at other industries, I look across at automotive manufacturing, I look across at aerospace, I see a very strong relationship. The government knows really clearly that what's good for automotive manufacturing is good for UK PLC. And I think you're absolutely right that we haven't had that kind of relationship in the past. So how is the sector deal going to move that forward? You're in a good position to see what the pull from government is for the sector deal. How much do you think they really want rail to be part of that?
Okay, well, I'm not going to gloss over the first bit of your question, so I'll talk a bit about diversity to start with, because I think this is something that really matters to me personally, and it matters to our industry in terms of getting the absolute best talent into our industry and changing some of the culture around the industry. At the top level, frankly, it's embarrassing in terms of the gender diversity and the ethnic diversity. I get criticised for my board being entirely, apart from one person, white, male, and at least as old as me. I can't choose those board members, though, because it's a member organisation, and we're not going to change it until the whole industry is changed. I think it is changing, but at the top level, we need to find a way of accelerating some of that. One of the really interesting things I talked about the RSA lecture I gave a while ago, which had a cumulative knowledge of the railway, which was enormous. But by definition, because of that, it wasn't the most diverse group of people. And a few weeks after that, I went to another event, Young Rail Professionals. Exactly the opposite, a hugely energetic, massively diverse group of people that joined the railway relatively recently, with a huge appetite to learn and understand. And I sort of was imagining in 20 years that group of people being the people at RSA, and that change and what that will mean for our industry and the way we work and what we deliver. So I think we all need to be advocates of that in our industry, but also in our leadership roles everywhere. So I think that I couldn't resist commenting on that piece. More generally, in terms of the sector deal, I mean, one of the odd things about, different things about my role and working in the railway more generally, compared to other sectors, is that most other sectors really, really struggle to get in to see ministers. We don't have that problem, and we've not had that problem for they are very, very engaged. Secretary of State's joke about the fact that if there's something being opened, then they have to compete with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister for the news opportunity. It's recognised as being important, and they want to influence and shape it. Sometimes too much. So sometimes that engagement gets too much into the detail, and we need to give them the confidence that the industry can deliver. We need, though, strategic decisions from government. Absolutely, that's critical. Funding is part of it, but we need to make the case for investment as part of it. We need to make the case for change, and digital railway is a key part of it. And that's the sector deal is started off as a very broad range of issues, because there's so much that can happen. And I see it as slightly different to other things. It's not so much a deal in the same way as automotive is, in a commercial sense. It's more about a deal about how we do deals, because the railway does deals with government all the time. But what we're saying effectively, in my view, is actually if we do deals in a slightly different way, we can deliver more as an industry, as a whole industry, for the country than if we carry on doing the same way. And accelerating the implementation of digital rail through a single group, effectively, that's owned and driven by the industry, working with government across digital and conventional signalling to give clarity of pipeline. I think that is key, and I think absolutely government, and I mean here the whole of government, has the appetite and the pull to hear what industry has to say. Long answer.
Good.
Sorry.
No. This is we want more detail on the issues. So, who's going to join me? Yes, Larry.
Larry Faulkner from Cogitare. Just a question, because when I look around the rail industry, I see there's a lot we could do to improve, and often at low cost by using data better. But what is lacking is the people with the drive and the imaginative thinking who are actually willing to make a change and do things differently. What are your suggestions for how the railway can improve in this area? And getting the right leaders.
I mean, I won't repeat a lot of the first half of the previous, but I think bringing in new and different people into the industry is part of that, and as part of change, both at the top level, but also right through the industry, through apprentices and so on. I think that's key. Being clear. Government being clear to start with what it wants from the railway, and then enabling the railway to deliver it, so that if you like, the primary contractors, the operators, the infrastructure can be clear with the supply chain what the problems and challenges are, and enable the innovation from the many small businesses across the railway that got fantastic ideas. And I think that's got to be part of it. Understanding the different parts of the industry and what small businesses contribute, how innovators and disruptors can contribute, embracing that is part of the culture change that I do believe is what we need to enable. And but sometimes there would be a perception that the so-called leaders are sort of standing in the way of change, and I don't think consciously anybody would want to do that. But the way things have worked sometimes haven't pushed that as fast as we can, so we need to change those systems. If you speak to the technical authority, if you like, within Network Rail, they're absolutely passionate about enabling innovation. But that doesn't filter through to the supply chain sometimes in terms of what could be done, and finding a way of unlocking that. I mean, Network Rail, it's open for business, they've advocated that, they mean that, but how we turn that into reality is hard. I know I was there for 13 years, and you can say things and mean things, but actually it's different to actually making them happen on the ground. So it is about leadership, it is about culture, it is about everybody rather than just individuals. It's being open for those challenges rather than closed to based on history.
I think to follow your point up, Larry, work is going on in terms of data standards across the industry.
I didn't talk about data. I should talk about data.
Interchange. So
I'll come back to data.
Hello, Paul. Audrey.
Hi.
I think that one of the problems that the rail industry has is that it is seen as what I would call a national treasure by so many, stakeholders. And as a result, so many of the stakeholders have all got different ideas as to what it should be and as to what it should be, delivering. So in as much as there is a culture issue within the rail industry, there is also a culture issue outside of the rail industry, and expectations of all the varied stakeholders, including the government, whom there are various governments, depending on where you stand on the government, they've got different ideas. So what is the plan that the rail industry has in order to try and bring all of the stakeholders heading towards the same agenda?
Yep. So I agree with you. I mean, it is a treasure. It is wonderful, and people do love it, and people love to meddle with things that they love and care about. So there's lots of good things in that, but it also presents challenges, as you imply. I mean, it's quite clear that when performance isn't as good as people would want to be, or when there are stories around problems in the railway, then people have got to the point where they wanted to see change. And the danger with that is that simple change actually potentially doesn't change anything. It doesn't help at all. So there's sort of simple changes that sometimes advocated don't do anything necessarily to confront the fact we need to continue to invest in capacity and in making sure we look after our national treasure assets, that we continue to grow capacity to provide more connections. That costs money. It doesn't, simple changes don't deal with the fact that actually the ticketing and fare system needs modernising. They don't deal with the fact that we need to improve the diversity of our workforce and bring in new skills. So those simple changes don't do anything about those things. Actually, change is harder than that. So what we've been trying to do and are trying to do is to show that we do have a plan. The railway industry does have a plan. Network Rail, train operators, freight operators, increasingly trying to work with the supply chain as well, do have a plan for what we can do to improve things for customers around ticketing and around fares, what we are doing to try and improve performance. We have a plan for what we can do to connect more communities and make the case for that investment. We have a plan for how we can reform the structure of franchising and regulation. and actually create more and more opportunities for the many thousands of people working the railway. So we have that plan at broad level. We need to deliver that plan. We need to explain that plan. And if people see that actually happening, then they will believe. And then the calls for superficial change, whatever it is, and I'm not trying to make a political statement, whether it's this way or that way, it sort of doesn't matter. Simple change doesn't actually solve those problems. We have to have, in any way we're organised, absolute obsessive focus on customers and value for taxpayers, and the reason why the railway is here for the economy and communities. That's what we need to focus on locally, joined up nationally. And so that's what we're trying to show and actually make true.
Thank you, Paul. I think that change in behaviour is all of us.
Yeah.
You know, we are the rail industry. It's up to us to put forward that change in behaviour, the way we work and the way we work with each other. So we've got 1 minute for a punchy question if somebody's got one burning a hole in their pocket. No? Okay, they've let you off the hook on that one.
Okay. Oh, yes.
1 minute.
5 or 6 years ago, perhaps longer, there was an absolute disaster on Eurostar with trains failed in the tunnel. And almost the only thing we heard about continental railways was that the TVGs in France were working perfectly. I went to Stockholm in May, and they just got their Prestige high-speed trains working after the damage caused at the same time. What can the rail group do to mine this sort of information from the continent and make sure the press doesn't continually tell us that problems only happen in Britain?
I was speaking with somebody who's advising at one of the European railways this morning about exactly this, but we can't tell the press what to write. I think it goes back to your point. Actually, it's about all of us, because we feed them with stuff that is unhelpful sometimes. We beat ourselves up as a railway. If you go back to McNulty a few years ago, claiming that there was an efficiency gap compared to other railways, absolute rubbish, but it caught hold in the imagination of the media and the public. We allowed that to happen. And I think we now know it's not right. I mean, the people's perception of overseas railways is driven by the very small bits that they see, which tend to be the nice shiny new bits, not the bits that are in a far worse state. That's their perception. That's the perceptions that are fed by media, and frankly, that's the perception fed by all of us. So I think we all have a role in saying, well, we, as this railway, are uniquely skilled at getting the most out of those aged assets in a very densely populated and developed country. We have the opportunity to go and sell that again overseas, and make sure in doing that, though, that it doesn't come across as complacent, because for me, being as good as any other railway isn't anywhere near good enough. We have to be better than that at doing what is needed in this country, which isn't always the same. So it's about all of us.